The knife was still in her hand when the guards dragged Lyra through the palace gates. She had not meant to hurt anyone. She had only meant to protect her younger brother from the tax collector who raised his hand against him. But the collector worked for the crown, and the crown did not forgive such things. Now she stood in chains before the great stone hall of the Alpha King, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The hall was cold and enormous, lit by torches that threw long shadows across the marble floor. Rows of nobles and warriors lined the walls, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. At the far end, on a throne carved from black wood, sat King Draven. He did not look like a man who smiled often. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp and unreadable, and his presence filled the room in a way that made the air feel heavier. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, but it carried to every corner of the hall without effort. "Explain yourself," he said, not looking up from the papers in his hand. Lyra's throat tightened. "My lord, my family owes a debt we cannot pay. The collector came to take my brother instead, as payment. I only tried to stop him." A murmur passed through the room. Debt slavery was common enough among the lower packs, but attacking a royal collector was a crime that could cost a person their life. Draven finally lifted his gaze to her. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "Your family's debt is significant," he said. "Large enough that a season in the dungeon would not settle it, nor would your death serve any purpose to the treasury." He set the papers down. "There is another way you can pay this debt," he continued. "You will serve in the palace until it is settled, not as a prisoner, as a servant." Lyra felt her stomach drop. Serving in the palace meant losing what little freedom she had left. It meant years, maybe her whole life, bound to people who saw her as nothing more than a body to give orders to. "For how long?" she asked, before she could stop herself. A ripple of shock went through the hall. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. But Draven did not react with anger. Instead, the faintest shadow of something like respect crossed his face. "Until I decide the debt is paid," he said simply. "Take her to the West Wing. She will be assigned to the chosen mate's chambers." Thoughts landed like stones in Lyra's chest. The chosen mate. Everyone in the kingdom had heard the news weeks earlier, carried on the wind from village to village. The Alpha King had found his fated match, a noblewoman named Kaya from the Ashwood Pack, chosen through the old bonding rites to secure peace between the two territories. The wedding celebrations were still being planned, and already merchants were selling trinkets with the couple's names stitched together in gold thread. Lyra had imagined many futures for herself in the moments before she was captured. None of them included spending her days waiting on the woman who would one day be queen. The guards pulled her forward, and she had no choice but to follow. The west wing of the palace was unlike anything Lyra had seen. The corridors were lined with tapestries, depicting the history of the wolf packs, their colors so vivid, they seemed to breathe in the torchlight. Servants moved briskly along the halls, heads down, careful not to make eye contact with anyone above their station. Lyra understood immediately that this was a place where mistakes were not forgiven easily. She was brought to a small chamber behind the kitchens, given a plain gray dress to replace her torn clothes, and told to report to the chosen mate's quarters before sunrise. An older servant named Nora, kind-eyed but tired, helped her dress and offered a few words of advice. "Keep your head down," Nora said. "Speak only when spoken to. Lady Kaya does not tolerate mistakes, and the king does not interfere with how she treats her staff." "Does he ever come to her chambers?" Lyra asked, unsure why the question mattered to her. Nora's expression flickered with something unreadable. "Rarely. Some say the bond between them is not what people believe it to be, but that is not something we speak of here." Before Lyra could ask more, a bell rang somewhere deep in the palace, signaling that it was time for the staff to begin their duties. Nora ushered her toward the door. The first morning was a blur of instructions. Lyra learned how to fold linens the way the noble houses preferred, how to carry trays without letting a single item shift, how to walk without making a sound on the polished floors. Every task felt like a test, and she was constantly aware of eyes watching her, waiting for her to fail. When she was finally brought before Lady Kaya, she understood immediately why the other servants seemed to shrink whenever her name was mentioned. Kaya was beautiful, in a sharp, deliberate way, with dark hair pulled into an elegant twist, and eyes that studied Lyra like a merchant inspecting damaged goods. She wore a gown of deep violet, the color of the Ashwood pack, and jewelry that alone was worth more than Lyra's family would earn in 10 lifetimes. "So this is my new servant," Kaya said, circling her slowly. "The one who attacked a royal collector." Lyra kept her eyes lowered, remembering Nora's warning. "Yes, my lady." "How fitting," Kaya said, a faint smile curling her lips. "A criminal serving royalty. I suppose the king thought this would humble you." Lyra said nothing, though the words stung more than she expected. "You will bring my meals, prepare my baths, and see to my wardrobe," Kaya continued. "You will not speak unless I ask you a question, and you will never look me directly in the eye. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lady." Kaya studied her for a long moment, as though searching for a reason to punish her simply for existing. Finally she turned away, gesturing dismissively. "Get out of my sight. I will call for you when I need something." Lyra left the chamber with her hands trembling, though she was careful to keep her face calm until she was out of view. She found an empty corridor and pressed her back against the cool stone wall, allowing herself a single breath of relief. It was there, in that quiet moment, that she first saw him. King Draven walked past the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 advisors deep in conversation about border patrols and pack alliances. He did not appear to notice her at first, his attention fixed on the men beside him. But just as he passed the intersection where she stood, his eyes flicked toward her for the briefest instant. It was not a long look, it could not have lasted more than a second, but something about it made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment, only a flicker of something she could not quite understand. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition, though they had never truly spoken beyond the hall where her fate had been decided. Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner with his advisors, and Lyra was left standing alone, wondering why her heart was beating faster than it had all morning. She told herself it meant nothing. He was the Alpha King, promised to a woman of noble blood, bound by ancient rights that could not be undone. She was a servant, paying off a debt, nothing more. Whatever she thought she saw in his eyes was likely her own imagination, twisted by exhaustion and fear. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking of that look more often than she wanted to admit. Her duties kept her busy from dawn until well past dark. She learned the rhythms of the palace, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction between servant and noble. She learned which corridors to avoid when Kaya was in a foul mood, which guards would look the other way if she needed a moment to rest, and which servants she could trust not to report her smallest mistakes to the head housekeeper. She also learned, slowly, that the palace was full of secrets. Late one evening, while carrying a tray of tea to Kaya's chambers, she overheard 2 guards speaking in low voices near the entrance to the throne room. "The bonding ceremony was rushed," one of them muttered. "Barely 3 months of courting before the elders declared it fated." "The alliance needed to be secured," the other replied. "Ashwood's territory borders the northern packs. Without this match, there would have been war within the year." "Still," the first guard said, glancing around before lowering his voice further, "the king does not act like a man who has found his fated mate. Have you seen how he looks at her? Like a stranger." Lyra slowed her steps, straining to hear more, but the guards noticed her approach and fell silent, exchanging a glance before nodding stiffly and moving on. She continued to Kaya's chambers, her mind racing with what she had heard. If the bond between Draven and Kaya was not what it seemed, what did that mean for the kingdom? And more troubling to her, though she refused to examine the thought too closely, what did that mean for the strange flicker of connection she had felt in his eyes? She delivered the tea without incident, enduring another round of cold instructions from Kaya, who complained about the temperature of the water and the arrangement of the cups. Lyra apologized, made the adjustments, and left as quickly as she could, grateful to escape the chamber's tense atmosphere. That night, lying on the narrow cot in the servants' quarters, she stared up at the cracked ceiling and allowed herself to think about her family. Her brother would be worried, wondering if she was safe, if she would ever return home. Her mother would be praying to the old gods for her protection. Lyra closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would pay the debt, however long it took, and she would find a way back to the life that had been stolen from her. She did not know, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, that the king who now held her fate in his hands was lying awake in his own chambers, staring at the ceiling with equally troubled thoughts, unable to explain why the image of a servant girl with tired eyes, had settled itself so firmly in his mind. The next morning began like any other, with the bell ringing before dawn and the scramble of servants preparing the palace for another day. But as Lyra made her way to the kitchens, she noticed a change in the air, a tension among the staff that had not been there before. "What's happening?" she asked Nora, who was hurrying past with an armful of linens. "The king has called a council meeting," Nora said, not slowing her pace. "Something about the northern border. And Lady Kaya has requested an early breakfast, so hurry, unless you want to feel her temper firsthand." Lyra rushed to the kitchens, gathering the tray as quickly as she could, her mind still lingering on the guard's whispered conversation from the night before. As she carried the tray toward the west wing, she passed the corridor that led to the council chamber, and for a moment, through the half-open doors, she caught sight of Draven, seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by advisors and warriors. He looked exhausted, the weight of leadership visible in the set of his shoulders, but even in that brief glimpse, she noticed how his eyes shifted toward the doorway, as though sensing her presence before she had even come into view. Their gazes met for the second time, and this time, neither looked away immediately. It was only a guard closing the doors that broke the moment, and Lyra hurried on toward Kaya's chambers, her pulse quickening in a way that both confused and unsettled her. She did not understand what was happening between them, if anything was happening at all, but she understood, with a growing sense of unease, that whatever future awaited her in this palace, it would not be as simple as counting days until her debt was paid. A scream echoed through the west wing, before Lyra had even set down her tray. She froze in the corridor, her hands tightening around the silver handles as the sound repeated, sharper this time, followed by the crash of something breaking against a wall. Servants rushed past her, whispering urgently to one another, and Lyra realized the sound was coming from Lady Kaya's chambers. She hurried forward, uncertain whether to enter or wait outside, when the door swung open and a young maid stumbled out, tears streaming down her face and a red mark blooming across her cheek. "She threw a mirror at me," the maid whispered, hurrying past Lyra without stopping, "just because I arranged the flowers wrong." Lyra's stomach twisted. She had heard whispers of Kaya's temper from the other servants, but this was the first time she had seen its aftermath so clearly. Steadying herself, she stepped into the chamber, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Kaya stood by the window, her chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. Shards of glass scattered across the floor near her feet. She turned as Lyra entered, her eyes narrowing. "Finally," she snapped. "I have been waiting for my tea for nearly an hour." "I apologize, my lady," Lyra said, keeping her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. She set the tray down carefully, avoiding the broken glass, and began pouring the tea, exactly as she had been taught. Kaya watched her closely, as though searching for any small imperfection to seize upon. "You are new," she said finally. "The one who attacked the collector." "Yes, my lady." "I have heard whispers about you," Kaya continued, circling her slowly. "That the king himself decided your punishment. That he chose to bring you here, to my chambers specifically, rather than sending you to the mines like any other criminal." Lyra kept her eyes lowered, her heart racing. "I do not know his reasons, my lady. I only follow his orders." Kaya's lips curved into a thin smile, though it did not reach her eyes. How convenient. "Well, let me make something clear to you. Whatever attention you may have caught from the king means nothing here. I am his fated mate, chosen through the sacred bonding rites. You are a servant, paying off a debt. Do not forget which one of us holds power in this palace." "I would never presume otherwise, my lady," Lyra said quickly, though something about the accusation made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. Kaya studied her for another long moment, before waving a hand dismissively. "Clean this glass before someone is injured, and do not mention this incident to anyone." Lyra nodded and began gathering the broken shards, careful not to cut herself, while Kaya settled onto a cushioned chair near the window, sipping her tea in silence. The tension in the room remained thick, and Lyra worked as quickly as she could, eager to escape the chamber's suffocating atmosphere. As she finished cleaning, she could not help but notice the emptiness in Kaya's expression as she stared out at the courtyard below. For a woman who had everything, position, wealth, a king bound to her by fate, she seemed remarkably unhappy. Lyra wondered, briefly, what could cause such misery in someone who appeared to have every reason to be content. She did not have long to wonder, because a knock at the door interrupted the silence, and a guard announced that the king requested Lady Kaya's presence in the council chamber immediately. Kaya sighed, setting down her cup with obvious irritation. "Tell him I will be there shortly," she said to the guard, then turned to Lyra. "You, come with me. I may need someone to carry documents." Lyra had no choice but to follow, trailing a respectful distance behind, as Kaya made her way through the palace corridors toward the council chamber. The walk gave Lyra an unexpected opportunity to observe the workings of the court, the way advisors bowed their heads as Kaya passed, the way guards straightened their posture, the underlying tension that seemed to run through every interaction in this place. When they arrived at the council chamber, the doors were already open, and Lyra caught sight of Draven seated at the head of the long table, his expression grave as he studied a map spread before him. Several advisors surrounded him, pointing to various locations and speaking in low, urgent tones. "The northern packs have been testing our borders," one advisor was saying. "Small incursions, nothing significant yet, but enough to suggest they are searching for weaknesses." "And what do they hope to find?" Draven asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in quiet conversation. "Instability," another advisor replied carefully. "There are whispers that the bonding between yourself and Lady Kaya was rushed, that the alliance with Ashwood may not be as solid as we present it to be." The room fell silent for a moment, and Lyra, standing near the doorway with the other servants, felt the tension thicken considerably. Kaya stepped forward at this moment, drawing every eye in the room. "The alliance is solid," she said firmly. "Ashwood's loyalty to the crown is absolute." Draven's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, Lyra thought she saw something flicker across his expression, though she could not quite name it. Frustration, perhaps, or resignation. "Of course," he said evenly. "Thank you for joining us, Lady Kaya. We were discussing troop movements along the northern border." The meeting continued for some time, with advisors debating strategy, and Kaya occasionally offering input regarding her father's territory and its resources. Lyra remained near the doorway, largely forgotten, observing the dynamics between the king and his chosen mate with growing curiosity. She noticed how carefully Draven addressed Kaya, polite but distant, never allowing warmth to enter his tone, the way it might with someone he cared for deeply. She noticed how Kaya, despite her confident exterior, occasionally glanced toward Draven with an expression that looked almost like uncertainty, quickly masked before anyone else could notice. It was a strange dynamic to witness, two people bound together by fate and politics, neither of them appearing entirely comfortable with the arrangement. The meeting eventually concluded, and as the advisors filed out of the chamber, Draven remained seated, studying the map before him with an expression of deep contemplation. Kaya lingered near the door, waiting for an escort, when she turned suddenly to Lyra. "Bring me my shawl from my chambers," she said. "I feel a chill." Lyra nodded and turned to leave, but as she did, her eyes met Draven's for the briefest moment. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, though something about the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. She quickly looked away and hurried from the chamber, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice aloud. The walk back to Kaya's chambers gave her time to process everything she had witnessed, the political tension surrounding the bonding, the whispered doubts among the guards, the strange distance between Draven and Kaya despite their supposed fated connection. None of it fit the picture the kingdom had been given, the story of a king who had found his true match and secured peace for his people. Something was wrong beneath the surface of this arrangement, and Lyra could not shake the feeling that she was being drawn into its center, whether she wished it or not. She retrieved the shawl and made her way back toward the council chamber, but as she approached, she overheard voices coming from within, low and tense. "You cannot continue treating the staff this way," Draven was saying, his voice carrying a note of controlled frustration. "There have been complaints. A servant was injured this morning." "They are servants," Kaya replied coolly. "Their comfort is not my concern." "It is mine," Draven said firmly. "This is still my palace, and I will not tolerate cruelty toward those who serve it." There was a pause, and Lyra could imagine the tension in the room, the way Kaya's expression likely hardened at being reprimanded. "Is this about the new girl?" Kaya asked finally, her voice sharp. "The one you personally assigned to my chambers?" Silence followed, long enough that Lyra's heart began to race with anticipation of his answer. "It is about basic decency," Draven said finally, his tone measured but firm. "Nothing more." Lyra did not wait to hear more. She hurried away from the door, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had overheard. Whatever tension existed between Draven and Kaya, it seemed to extend beyond mere political discomfort. There was something deeper at play, something neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge openly. She delivered the shawl a few minutes later, keeping her expression carefully neutral as Kaya accepted it without comment, her earlier irritation replaced by a cool, calculating silence. Lyra excused herself as quickly as etiquette allowed, grateful to escape the charged atmosphere of the chamber. As she made her way back toward the servants' quarters that evening, exhausted from the day's events, she found herself replaying the moment when Draven's eyes had met hers across the council chamber. There had been something in that look, something that went beyond simple curiosity or passing interest. She told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that whatever she thought she saw meant nothing. He was bound by fate to another woman, and she was nothing more than a servant paying off her family's debt. Whatever strange connection seemed to exist between them was likely nothing more than her own exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But as sleep finally claimed her that night, she could not shake the feeling that her time in this palace would be far more complicated than she had ever anticipated, and that the careful walls she had built around her heart were already beginning to crack, whether she wanted them to or not. The candle had burned down to nearly nothing by the time Draven realized he had been staring at the same page of reports for almost an hour without reading a single word. He set the papers aside and rubbed his eyes, frustration building at his own inability to focus. There were border disputes to resolve, trade agreements to review, and yet his mind kept drifting to a servant girl with tired eyes and a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her despite her circumstances. It made no sense to him. He had met countless people throughout his life, warriors and nobles and diplomats, each leaving some impression before fading into the background of his memory. But something about Lyra lingered in his thoughts in a way he could not explain, an unwelcome distraction he had no time for, especially now. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His advisor, an older wolf named Corin who had served the royal family for decades, entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of loyal service. "You look troubled," Corin observed, settling into the chair across from Draven's desk. "Border reports," Draven said, gesturing vaguely at the papers before him, though both of them understood this was only partially true. Corin studied him for a long moment, his expression knowing in the way only someone who had watched a person grow from childhood could manage. "This is about more than borders." Draven considered denying it, but exhaustion made him too tired to maintain the pretense. "The bonding ceremony," he said finally. Something about it never felt right. Corin's expression grew serious. "The elders performed the ritual according to tradition. The signs pointed to Lady Kaya as your fated match." "Did they?" Draven asked, his voice carrying an edge of frustration he rarely allowed himself to show. "Or did the elders simply need an alliance with Ashwood, urgently enough that they interpreted ambiguous signs in the way that suited our political needs?" Corin was silent for a long moment, and his silence spoke volumes. "The northern threat is real," he said finally. "Without Ashwood's support, we would face war on two fronts. The alliance was necessary." "That does not mean the bond itself is real," Draven said quietly. Corin leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Even if your instincts tell you something is wrong, the ritual cannot simply be undone. Breaking a sanctioned bond would destabilize the alliance and potentially plunge the kingdom into the very war it was meant to prevent. You must consider what is at stake beyond your own feelings." Draven knew this already, understood it, with the clarity of a leader who had spent his entire life placing duty above personal desire. And yet something within him rebelled against the idea of spending the rest of his existence bound to a woman who felt more like a political obligation than a true mate. "I understand the stakes," he said finally. "I am not suggesting I would act rashly. I am simply saying that something about this bond does not feel the way the old stories describe a true mate connection." Corin studied him carefully. "The old stories are stories, Draven. Perhaps the reality of a bond is less dramatic than the tales suggest." Draven wanted to believe this, wanted to convince himself that the discomfort he felt around Kaya was simply the natural adjustment period between two people, forced together by circumstance rather than choice. But the memory of Lyra's eyes meeting his across the council chamber contradicted this explanation entirely. He had felt something in that moment, something immediate and undeniable, a pull he could not attribute to mere curiosity. He said nothing of this to Corin, unwilling to voice a suspicion that felt both impossible and increasingly difficult to ignore. The conversation shifted to matters of border security, and eventually Corin took his leave, promising to return with updated reports the following morning. Alone again in his study, Draven found himself staring at the dying candle, his thoughts circling back once more to the servant girl, who had somehow captured his attention, despite every reason he had to ignore her presence entirely. The following days brought a new rhythm to palace life, one that Lyra found herself adjusting to with cautious efficiency. She learned to anticipate Kaya's moods, to complete her tasks quickly enough to avoid criticism, while remaining invisible enough to escape unnecessary attention. She learned which servants she could trust, forming a tentative friendship with Nora and a younger servant named Dara, who worked in the kitchens and often shared small kindnesses, an extra portion of bread, a warning about Kaya's temper before Lyra encountered it firsthand. Despite her efforts to remain unnoticed, she found herself crossing paths with Draven more frequently than seemed like simple coincidence. He appeared in corridors she happened to be walking through, attended meetings that required her presence as Kaya's assistant, and once, memorably, nearly collided with her while she carried a tray of dishes toward the kitchens. "My apologies," he said, steadying her arm before the tray could tip completely, his touch brief but firm enough that she felt it long after he released her. "It was my fault, my lord," she said quickly, though she was certain the collision had been entirely his doing, his attention clearly focused elsewhere as he walked. He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "How are you adjusting to your duties?" he asked, the question surprising her with its unexpected personal nature. "Well enough, my lord," she replied carefully, unsure how to navigate a conversation with the king that felt strangely informal, despite the power imbalance between them. "Lady Kaya can be demanding," he said, an observation rather than a question, though something in his tone suggested he was seeking confirmation of concerns he already harbored. Lyra hesitated, uncertain how much honesty was safe to offer. "She has high standards, my lord. I am learning to meet them." Draven's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps understanding. "That is a diplomatic answer. I try to be careful with my words, my lord," she admitted. "A wise practice in this palace," he said, and for a moment, something almost like warmth entered his tone. "If you encounter any difficulties, you may bring them to my attention directly. I take the treatment of my staff seriously." The offer surprised her, given everything she had heard about the strict hierarchy separating royalty from servants. "That is generous of you, my lord. It is simply right," he said, his tone firm. "No one within these walls should suffer unnecessary cruelty, regardless of their position." Before she could respond further, a group of advisors approached, drawing his attention away, and he offered her a brief nod before continuing on his way. Lyra remained standing in the corridor for a long moment afterward, the tray of dishes forgotten in her hands as she processed the strange exchange. There had been something in his eyes during their conversation, an intensity that went beyond simple courtesy toward a servant. She told herself, once again, that she was imagining connections that did not exist, allowing exhaustion and loneliness to distort her perception of small kindnesses into something more significant. But as the days continued to pass, these small encounters accumulated, each one leaving her more confused about the nature of whatever seemed to be forming between them. One evening, several weeks into her service, Lyra was summoned unexpectedly to Draven's private study. A guard delivered the message, offering no explanation beyond the king's request for her presence, and Lyra found herself walking through unfamiliar corridors toward the private wing of the palace, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and something she refused to name. She found him seated behind a large desk covered in maps and reports, his expression tired, but his eyes sharp as she entered. "You asked for me, my lord," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervousness twisting through her. "I did," he said, gesturing for her to enter fully. "I understand you have experience with herbal remedies. One of the healers mentioned your knowledge when treating an injured guard recently." Lyra blinked in surprise, unsure how word of her small assistance to the injured guard had reached the king's attention. "My mother taught me some remedies, my lord. Nothing extensive. I have a matter requiring discretion," Draven said, standing and moving toward a cabinet along the wall. Corin, my advisor, has been suffering from persistent headaches. The palace healers have offered remedies without success. I wondered if your knowledge might prove more effective. The request seemed innocent enough, a simple task related to her skills rather than any personal interest. And yet something about the late hour, the private setting, the way his eyes lingered on her as he spoke, suggested this meeting carried significance beyond its stated purpose. I would be happy to help, my lord, if you believe it might assist your advisor, she said carefully. Draven nodded, retrieving a small pouch of dried herbs from the cabinet and setting them on the desk before her. These were gathered from the eastern gardens. Perhaps you can identify a combination that might provide relief. Lyra examined the herbs carefully, recognizing several varieties from her mother's teachings, mentally calculating combinations that might ease tension headaches. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of Draven's presence nearby, watching her with an attention that felt far more focused than the simple task warranted. This combination should help, she said finally, separating several herbs into a small cloth. Steeped in hot water, taken twice daily, it should ease the tension causing his discomfort. Thank you, Draven said, taking the offered herbs, his fingers brushing against hers briefly as he did so. The contact was minimal, accidental perhaps, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her that she quickly tried to suppress. Is there anything else you require, my lord? She asked, eager to escape the charged atmosphere of the private study, before her composure crumbled entirely. Draven studied her for a long moment, something conflicted passing behind his eyes, as though he were debating whether to say something further. Finally, he shook his head slightly. No, thank you for your assistance. You may return to your duties. Lyra nodded and turned to leave, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Lyra, he said, and she turned back, surprised that he knew her name at all, given how rarely nobility bothered to learn the names of servants. Thank you. For everything. The words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple task she had completed, and Lyra left the study with her mind spinning, increasingly certain that whatever was happening between them was far more complicated than mere coincidence or simple courtesy, though she remained determined to ignore the implications for as long as possible. The great hall glittered with candlelight, the night of the formal dinner. Every noble family of standing gathered to celebrate the approaching bonding ceremony between King Draven and Lady Kaya. Lyra stood along the wall with the other servants, ready to refill goblets and clear plates as needed, her eyes carefully lowered as etiquette demanded. From her position she could observe the entire gathering, the elaborate gowns and polished armor, the careful smiles that masked whatever true feelings lay beneath the surface of court politics. Kaya sat beside Draven at the head table, radiant in a gown of deep crimson, her laughter carrying across the hall as she engaged in conversation with visiting dignitaries from Ashwood. To any observer unfamiliar with the tension Lyra had witnessed in private moments, the couple appeared perfectly matched, a king and his chosen mate, ready to secure peace for their people. But Lyra had seen enough by now to recognize the careful performance for what it was. She noticed how Draven's smile never quite reached his eyes, how his responses to Kaya's touches seemed measured rather than genuine, how his gaze occasionally drifted toward the servants along the wall, though she told herself this was simple habit rather than any specific searching. The evening progressed through several courses, each more elaborate than the last, and Lyra found herself constantly in motion, refilling wine, clearing dishes, attending to the needs of nobles who barely acknowledged her existence, beyond brief gestures indicating what they required. It was during the fourth course that trouble began. A visiting noblewoman from a neighboring pack, unfamiliar with palace customs, addressed Lyra directly, asking about the origin of a particular dish being served. Lyra answered politely, explaining the ingredients as best she understood them, grateful for the simple interaction after hours of being treated as invisible. Kaya, however, seemed to view this small exchange as an unacceptable breach of protocol. "You address my servants now?" she said to the visiting noblewoman, her tone light but carrying an edge that immediately silenced nearby conversations. How curious. In Ashwood, we do not typically converse with the help. The noblewoman flushed, clearly embarrassed by the public correction. "My apologies, Lady Kaya. I did not realize." "It is quite all right," Kaya said, though her attention shifted pointedly to Lyra. The girl simply forgets her place occasionally. A remnant of her criminal background, I suppose. The words landed like a slap, and Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain composure. Several nearby nobles turned to observe the exchange, their expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed amusement. "Tell them, girl," Kaya continued, her voice growing sharper. "What crime brought you into royal service?" Lyra's throat tightened. She had known, on some level, that her past would eventually be used against her in this manner, but the public nature of the humiliation still caught her off guard. "I attacked a royal tax collector, my lady," she said quietly, keeping her eyes lowered. "Speak up," Kaya said. "Our guests cannot hear you." "I attacked a royal tax collector, my lady," Lyra repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to maintain control. Murmurs spread through the nearby tables, and Lyra felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Judgment and curiosity, mixing into an atmosphere she found nearly unbearable. She wanted nothing more than to disappear from the hall entirely, to escape the humiliation Kaya seemed determined to inflict upon her. "How fascinating," Kaya continued, clearly enjoying the attention her cruelty had generated. "A criminal serving at the king's own table. I suppose it speaks to his generous nature, taking pity on such unfortunate creatures." Lyra remained silent, unable to formulate any response that would not worsen her situation. She glanced briefly toward Draven, hoping for some intervention, but his expression remained carefully neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts on the matter. Kaya, apparently satisfied with the humiliation she had orchestrated, turned back to her conversation with the visiting dignitaries, dismissing Lyra entirely from her attention. Lyra retreated to the wall as quickly as decorum allowed, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and something closer to anger than she typically allowed herself to feel. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of activity, Lyra moving mechanically through her duties while trying to ignore the occasional whispered comments and curious glances that followed her through the hall. She kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will, refusing to give Kaya the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the public humiliation had affected her. It was not until the gathering finally concluded, guests dispersing to their chambers and servants beginning the lengthy process of clearing the hall, that Lyra allowed herself a moment of privacy in a small alcove near the kitchens, pressing her hands against her face as she tried to steady her breathing. She did not notice Draven's approach until he was standing directly before her, his expression carrying an intensity that immediately drew her attention. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Lyra straightened quickly, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "I am fine, my lord, simply tired from the evening's duties." "Lyra," he said, his tone carrying something that sounded almost like an apology. "What happened tonight should not have occurred." "It is not my place to comment on such matters, my lord," she said carefully, though something in his expression suggested he wanted more honesty than diplomatic deflection. "I am asking you to comment," he said firmly. "What Kaya said, the way she treated you, it was unacceptable." Lyra hesitated, uncertain how much honesty was wise given the circumstances. "She is your chosen mate, my lord. It is not my place to criticize her actions." "Perhaps not," Draven said, his jaw tightening slightly, "but it is mine." Something in his tone carried a weight that suggested deeper frustration than the immediate incident warranted, and Lyra found herself studying his expression carefully, searching for understanding of the complicated emotions clearly moving beneath his controlled exterior. "My lord," she said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but I have endured worse treatment before. I will survive this." "That should not be the standard you measure your treatment against," he said, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been anger, though it did not seem directed at her. "You deserve better than simply surviving." The words caught her off guard, carrying an intimacy that felt inappropriate given their respective positions, and yet she found herself unable to look away from the intensity in his eyes. "My lord," she began, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected statement, but before she could finish, a servant approached, with an urgent message requiring his attention elsewhere. Draven's expression shifted immediately back to the careful neutrality expected of a king, though as he turned to leave, he glanced back at her one final time, something unspoken passing between them that neither dared to voice openly. "Take the evening to rest," he said, his voice returning to formal distance. "Your duties can wait until morning." Lyra nodded, watching him disappear down the corridor with the servant, her mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. Whatever careful boundaries she had tried to maintain between herself and the king were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, and she found herself both terrified and inexplicably drawn to whatever seemed to be forming between them despite every reason such a connection should remain impossible. She retreated to the servants' quarters that night, exhaustion finally overtaking the tumultuous emotions of the evening, though sleep came slowly, her mind replaying every moment of the day, from Kaya's cruel public humiliation to the unexpected warmth in Draven's eyes as he expressed concern for her well-being. Whatever was happening within the palace walls, she understood with growing certainty that it was far more complicated than simple politics or fated bonds, and that she herself had somehow become entangled in a situation with consequences she could not yet fully comprehend. Draven's study was silent, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace, when he finally allowed the fury he had suppressed all evening to surface. He had watched Kaya humiliate Lyra in front of the entire court, watched the visiting nobles whisper and stare, watched Lyra's composure hold despite the cruelty directed at her, and through it all, he had said nothing, bound by the careful political dance required of a king maintaining an essential alliance. The restraint had cost him more than he expected, a growing pressure building behind his ribs throughout the remainder of the evening. Now, alone in his private study with only the fire and his own thoughts for company, that pressure finally broke free. He poured himself a glass of wine, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted it, memories of the dinner replaying relentlessly in his mind. Kaya's voice, sharp and deliberately cruel, forcing Lyra to publicly recount her crime for the entertainment of nobility, who viewed her as nothing more than an amusing curiosity. The way Lyra's cheeks had flushed with humiliation, while she maintained enough composure to prevent complete collapse in front of the crowd. He should not care this much. He told himself this repeatedly, attempting to rationalize the intensity of emotion building within him, as simple concern for the treatment of his staff, nothing more significant than basic decency, demanding fair treatment for those who served the crown. But he knew, even as he attempted this rationalization, that the anger burning through him extended far beyond simple concern for proper treatment of servants. The wine glass shattered in his grip before he consciously registered tightening his hand around it, shards scattering across the desk and floor, a thin line of blood appearing across his palm, where a piece of broken glass had caught his skin. He stared at his hand for a long moment, almost surprised by the physical manifestation of emotions he had been trying desperately to contain. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Corin entered without waiting for response, his expression shifting to concern as he noticed the broken glass and blood. "What happened?" Corin asked, moving quickly toward the desk. "Nothing," Draven said, his voice rougher than intended. "An accident." Corin studied the scene skeptically, but did not press further, instead retrieving a cloth to help clean the mess, while Draven wrapped his injured hand. "This is about tonight's dinner," Corin said finally, his tone carrying quiet understanding rather than judgment. Draven said nothing, which was answer enough for his longtime advisor. "The way Lady Kaya treated the servant girl," Corin continued carefully, "it reflected poorly on the crown. Several of the visiting dignitaries commented on the incident with visible discomfort. It should not have happened," Draven said, his jaw tightening. "I should have intervened." "You could not. Without raising questions about your personal investment in the matter," Corin said pointedly, watching Draven's reaction carefully. Draven met his advisor's gaze, understanding immediately that Corin had noticed far more than he had let on regarding the king's growing attention toward the servant girl in question. "What are you suggesting?" he asked carefully. "I am suggesting," Corin said, choosing his words deliberately, "that you should examine your own feelings before they create complications neither of us can easily resolve." The directness of the statement caught Draven off guard, though he could not entirely deny the truth behind it. "The bonding ritual declared Kaya my fated mate," he said, though the words carried little conviction even to his own ears. "Did it?" Corin asked. "Or did circumstances require an alliance urgently enough that the ritual's ambiguous signs were interpreted to serve that need?" This was the same question Draven had voiced to himself countless times since the ceremony, and hearing it spoken aloud by his most trusted advisor made the possibility feel more real, more dangerous, than when it remained confined to his private thoughts. Even if that were true, Draven said slowly, breaking a sanctioned bond would have severe consequences. War with Ashwood, instability within our own borders, the northern packs seizing the opportunity to exploit our weakness. All true, Corin agreed. Which is precisely why you must be certain, absolutely certain, before allowing whatever you feel toward this servant girl to influence decisions that affect the entire kingdom. Draven absorbed this warning silently, understanding the wisdom behind it, even as something within him rebelled against the constraint. He had spent his entire life placing duty above personal desire, and yet the intensity of what he felt whenever Lyra was near defied every rational explanation he attempted to construct. I do not know what is happening, he admitted finally, the confession feeling strange after so many years of careful control over his own emotions. I have never experienced anything like this before, not even during my initial introduction to Kaya. Corin studied him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. The old stories described the true mate bond as undeniable, immediate, impossible to ignore once recognized. If what you describe feeling toward this girl matches those descriptions more closely than anything you have felt toward Lady Kaya, that carries significance we cannot simply dismiss. But the ritual, Draven said, though his voice carried less certainty now. Rituals can be manipulated, Corin said quietly, by elders eager to secure necessary alliances, by political pressures that outweigh spiritual accuracy. I am not suggesting this occurred with certainty, only that it remains a possibility worth investigating before you commit yourself entirely to a bond that may not reflect true fate. The suggestion carried dangerous implications, questioning the validity of a sacred ritual performed by trusted elders, and yet Draven found himself unable to dismiss the possibility entirely, especially given how thoroughly it aligned with his own growing suspicions. What would such an investigation require? He asked finally. Discretion, Corin said firmly, and time we may not have in abundance, given how quickly the bonding ceremony approaches. I will make careful inquiries, speak with elders who might possess knowledge of any irregularities during the ritual. But you must proceed cautiously, Draven. If Kaya or her father suspect you are questioning the legitimacy of the bond, the consequences could prove immediate and severe. Draven nodded, understanding the delicate balance required moving forward. Whatever truth existed regarding the nature of his bond with Kaya, uncovering it would require careful navigation of political tensions that could easily spiral into conflict if handled poorly. After Corin departed, Draven remained alone in his study, staring at his bandaged hand and the small stains of blood still visible on the desk where his broken glass had rested. The physical reminder of his loss of control troubled him deeply. A king known throughout his kingdom for unwavering composure, now finding himself unable to contain emotions he barely understood. He thought of Lyra, of the quiet strength she had displayed throughout the humiliation Kaya inflicted upon her, of the brief moments of connection that continued accumulating between them despite every reason such a connection should remain impossible. He thought of her eyes meeting his across crowded rooms, of the warmth in her voice during their private conversation in his study, of the way his own composure seemed to fracture whenever she was near. If Corin's suspicions proved accurate, if the bond with Kaya had indeed been manufactured through political necessity rather than genuine fate, everything Draven understood about his future would require complete reconsideration. The alliance with Ashwood, the peace it was meant to secure, his own personal happiness, all of it hung in delicate balance, dependent on truths that remained frustratingly elusive. He resolved, as the fire burned low and exhaustion finally began overtaking him, that he would uncover the truth, regardless of the risks involved. He owed this much to himself, to Lyra, and perhaps even to Kaya, who deserved a genuine bond, rather than one built upon political convenience and manufactured fate. Whatever the truth revealed, he would face it directly, no longer content to simply accept circumstances that felt increasingly wrong the longer he examined them. The summons came earlier than expected, a guard appearing at the servants' quarters before dawn to inform Lyra that the king required her presence in his private study immediately. She dressed quickly, questions swirling through her mind about what could possibly warrant such an early request. As she followed the guard through the quiet corridors of the palace, still shadowed with the last remnants of night, she noticed his hand was bandaged, a detail that seemed strange, but which she did not think to question until later. Draven was seated behind his desk when she arrived, papers scattered before him, though his attention seemed distant, focused on something beyond the immediate work in front of him. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, a weariness that suggested he had not slept well, if at all. "You asked for me, my lord?" she said, keeping her voice steady despite the early hour and unusual circumstances. "I did," he said, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, an invitation that surprised her, given the strict boundaries typically maintained between royalty and servants. "I have need of your assistance again." "Of course, my lord," she said, settling carefully into the offered seat. He studied her for a long moment, before continuing, his expression carrying an intensity that made her increasingly aware of the private nature of their meeting. "Corin's headaches have improved considerably since your remedy," he said finally. "He has requested a larger supply for continued use." Lyra nodded, relieved by the simple, practical nature of the request. "I can prepare a larger batch, my lord. It will require gathering additional herbs from the gardens." "I will arrange for you to have access whenever needed," Draven said. "Consider this an ongoing responsibility, separate from your duties to Lady Kaya." The suggestion carried significant implications, essentially granting her expanded freedom within the palace, under the guise of herbal remedies, and Lyra found herself wondering at the true purpose behind such an arrangement. "Thank you, my lord," she said carefully. "I am happy to help in whatever capacity proves useful." Draven nodded, though he continued studying her with an expression she could not entirely decipher. "Lyra," he said finally, "may I ask you something personal?" The question caught her off guard, given the careful distance typically maintained between them despite their growing familiarity. "Of course, my lord," she said, though uncertainty colored her tone. "Your family," he said. "Do you often think of them, since coming into royal service?" The question surprised her with its unexpected tenderness, and she found herself answering honestly, despite her usual caution around expressing personal feelings to nobility. "Every day, my lord, my brother especially. He is young, and I worry about how our mother manages without my assistance." "Your brother, the one you protected from the tax collector," Draven said, and Lyra nodded, surprised he remembered such specific details from her initial appearance before the court. "Yes, my lord. He is only 12, too young to defend himself against grown men, demanding payment we could not provide." Draven's expression shifted, something like admiration crossing his features. "You acted to protect him, despite the risk to yourself." "I could not simply watch him suffer, my lord," Lyra said quietly. "Whatever consequences I faced seemed preferable to allowing harm to come to him." "That is a rare kind of courage," Draven said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Many would have prioritized their own safety over protecting another, even a beloved family member." Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected praise, uncertain how to respond to such direct acknowledgement of her actions. "I only did what any sister would do, my lord." "Perhaps," Draven said, "though I have observed enough of court life to know that selflessness is rarer than it should be, particularly among those with power to spare." The conversation continued in this manner for some time, Draven asking questions about her family, her childhood, her hopes for the future once her debt was paid, and Lyra found herself answering with increasing honesty, the careful walls she typically maintained around personal matters, gradually lowering in the face of his genuine interest. She learned, in turn, small details about his own life, his childhood training as heir to the throne, the weight of responsibility he had carried since his father's passing years earlier, the isolation that came with leadership that separated him from genuine connection with those around him. "It must be lonely," she said at one point, "carrying such responsibility, with so few people who understand its true weight." "It is," Draven admitted, his voice carrying vulnerability she had not expected from someone typically so composed and controlled. "Kaya understands the political demands of leadership, having grown up within a similar system, but there is little genuine warmth between us, despite the bond that supposedly connects us." The admission surprised her with its directness, and Lyra found herself uncertain how to respond to such personal disclosure from the king himself. "My lord," she said carefully, "should you be sharing such thoughts with me?" "Perhaps not," Draven said, something rueful entering his expression. "And yet I find myself unable to help it. There is something about speaking with you that feels different from every other conversation I engage in throughout my days here." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither dared to voice explicitly, and Lyra felt her heart racing with a combination of fear and something she refused to name, an emotion that felt dangerously close to hope, despite every reason such hope should remain firmly suppressed. "My lord," she began, uncertain how to navigate the conversation's increasingly personal direction, but before she could finish, Draven stood abruptly, moving toward the window as though needing physical distance to regain composure. "I apologize," he said, his back to her. "I have overstepped appropriate boundaries. Please forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive, my lord," Lyra said quietly, though her own heart continued racing with the intensity of what had just transpired between them. Draven turned back to face her, his expression carefully controlled once more, though something lingered in his eyes that suggested the careful composure required considerable effort to maintain. "You should return to your duties," he said. "Lady Kaya will be expecting you soon." Lyra nodded, standing to leave, though she paused at the door, uncertain whether to acknowledge the strange intimacy of their conversation, or simply proceed as though nothing significant had occurred. "My lord," she said finally, turning back toward him, "thank you for trusting me with such honesty." Something flickered across his expression, gratitude perhaps, or relief that she had not reacted with the horror or discomfort such intimate disclosure might have warranted. She left the study with her mind spinning, the careful boundaries she had maintained around her growing feelings toward the king, increasingly difficult to sustain, given the intimacy of their exchange. Whatever was developing between them defied every rational explanation, every careful precaution she had attempted to maintain since first arriving at the palace. As the days continued to pass following this conversation, their interactions grew increasingly frequent, always carefully justified through the guise of herbal remedies or administrative tasks that required her presence, though both understood the true purpose behind these arrangements extended far beyond such practical necessities. They spoke of philosophy during quiet moments in the gardens while she gathered herbs, of childhood memories while she prepared remedies in his private study, of hopes and fears neither typically shared with anyone, given their respective positions within the rigid hierarchy of palace life. Lyra found herself anticipating these encounters with an eagerness she tried desperately to suppress, understanding the danger inherent in developing feelings for a king bound by sacred ritual to another woman, and yet despite every rational argument against allowing such feelings to flourish, she found herself powerless to prevent the growing connection developing between them, a connection that felt increasingly undeniable, despite the impossible circumstances surrounding it. She knew, with growing certainty, that whatever was happening between them could not remain hidden indefinitely, and that when the truth eventually surfaced, the consequences would prove significant for everyone involved, particularly for a servant girl with no power or protection, beyond whatever the king himself might be willing to provide. The scaffold above the garden pathway groaned ominously, moments before it collapsed, sending workers scrambling, and sending a shower of wooden beams crashing down exactly where Lyra had been standing only seconds earlier. She managed to throw herself sideways at the last moment, instinct rather than conscious thought saving her from what would have certainly been serious injury, perhaps worse. She landed hard against the garden path, pain radiating through her shoulder, where she had struck the stone edging, but alive, and largely unharmed compared to what might have occurred. Workers rushed to assist her, helping her stand while others began assessing the damage to the collapsed scaffold that had been erected for decorations related to the upcoming bonding ceremony. Lyra's heart pounded as she surveyed the wreckage, understanding how close she had come to serious injury. "Are you hurt?" one of the workers asked, concern evident in his voice. "I am fine," Lyra said, though her voice trembled slightly as she assessed her own condition, relieved to find nothing beyond minor bruising and a scraped shoulder. Just startled. Word of the incident spread quickly through the palace, and within the hour, Lyra found herself being questioned by palace guards regarding the circumstances of the collapse. The scaffold, they explained, had been recently inspected and found structurally sound, making its sudden failure suspicious enough to warrant investigation. "Did you notice anything unusual before the collapse?" one guard asked, his tone carrying professional concern rather than accusation. "No," Lyra said honestly. "I was simply walking through the garden to gather herbs when I heard the wood groaning above me. I only had time to move before it fell." The guard nodded, making notes, though something in his expression suggested he harbored suspicions he was not prepared to voice openly. Lyra was eventually dismissed, though the incident left her deeply unsettled, uncertain whether the collapse had been genuine accident or something more deliberate. She did not have long to wonder, because that evening, while attending to Kaya's chambers, she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst suspicions. Kaya was speaking with one of her personal attendants, a woman named Sella, who had traveled with her from Ashwood, their voices low, but audible, through the partially open door, as Lyra approached with the evening meal. The scaffold incident should have eliminated the problem entirely, Kaya was saying, frustration evident in her tone. How did she manage to avoid injury? Luck, my lady, Sella replied. Nothing more. Shall we attempt another approach? Lyra froze in the corridor, her blood running cold as the implications of the conversation became devastatingly clear. The scaffold collapse had not been an accident at all, but a deliberate attempt orchestrated by Kaya herself to eliminate her as a perceived threat. Patience, Kaya said finally. We must be more careful. If the king suspects any connection between us and the incident, the consequences could prove severe. But she will not remain a problem indefinitely. I have not secured this bond only to have some servant girl threaten everything I have worked toward. Lyra retreated quietly from the door, her hands trembling as she processed what she had overheard. Kaya had attempted to harm her, potentially kill her, motivated by jealousy over whatever connection had developed between Lyra and Draven. The realization terrified her, understanding that she now faced genuine danger within the very walls, meant to serve as her temporary prison while paying off her family's debt. She knew she needed to inform someone, though the question of who she could trust with such dangerous knowledge weighed heavily upon her. Reporting Kaya's actions directly could result in severe consequences if Kaya denied the accusations and turned the situation against Lyra instead, especially given the power imbalance between a noble chosen mate and a servant with a criminal history. Ultimately, she decided the risk of remaining silent outweighed the danger of speaking up, and she made her way toward Draven's private study that evening, uncertain whether he would even be present given the late hour, but desperate to share what she had discovered, before Kaya's next attempt proved more successful. Draven was indeed present, reviewing reports by candlelight when she knocked hesitantly at his door. Lyra, he said, surprise evident in his voice as he looked up from his papers. Is something wrong? It is quite late for you to be seeking an audience. My lord, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. I need to speak with you about the scaffold incident this afternoon. His expression shifted immediately to concern. I heard about the collapse. Are you injured? Only minor bruising, my lord, she said. But I fear the collapse was not accidental. She recounted the conversation she had overheard between Kaya and her attendant, watching as Draven's expression darkened progressively throughout her explanation, his jaw tightening with barely contained fury by the time she finished speaking. Are you certain of what you heard? He asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the obvious anger simmering beneath the surface. I am certain, my lord, Lyra said. Lady Kaya spoke of eliminating me as a problem, of previous attempts that failed. I do not believe I misunderstood her meaning. Draven was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had shared. This changes everything, he said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying an intensity that made Lyra's breath catch. I suspected tension existed regarding our growing connection, but I did not imagine Kaya would resort to attempting actual harm. My lord, Lyra said carefully, what will you do? I do not yet know, Draven admitted, frustration evident in his tone. Confronting Kaya directly risks revealing the extent of my own feelings, which could prove dangerous given the political sensitivity of our bond. But I cannot allow your safety to remain threatened while I consider the appropriate response. He paced the length of his study, clearly working through various possibilities, while Lyra remained standing near the door, uncertain what role she should play in whatever decisions he ultimately reached. I will assign additional guards to monitor your safety, he said finally, turning back to face her. Discreetly, so as not to alert Kaya that her plans have been discovered. In the meantime, I will consult with Corin regarding how to proceed given this new information. Thank you, my lord, Lyra said, relief evident in her voice despite the continued uncertainty surrounding her situation. Draven studied her for a long moment, something conflicted passing behind his eyes. Lyra, he said finally. I owe you an apology. Whatever danger you now face exists because of feelings that developed between us. Feelings I should have controlled more carefully, given the complications they have created. My lord, Lyra said, surprised by his willingness to accept responsibility for circumstances that felt far beyond either of their control. You cannot blame yourself for Kaya's actions. Whatever exists between us developed naturally, without either of us seeking to create such complications deliberately. Perhaps, Draven said, though his expression suggested he remained unconvinced. Regardless, I will ensure your safety moving forward, whatever that requires. The conversation shifted to practical matters regarding security arrangements, though the underlying tension between them remained palpable, both acutely aware of the danger now threatening whatever connection had developed, despite their attempts at maintaining appropriate distance. As Lyra finally left the study that evening, escorted by a guard Draven had summoned for her protection, she found herself grappling with the reality that her situation within the palace had grown far more precarious than she had initially understood. Kaya's jealousy had escalated to genuine danger, and Lyra now understood that surviving her remaining time in royal service would require far more caution than she had previously exercised. Yet despite the fear that now colored her daily existence within the palace walls, she could not deny the warmth that had spread through her at Draven's evident concern for her safety, his willingness to prioritize her well-being, despite the political complications such prioritization created. Whatever developed between them, however impossible or dangerous the circumstances surrounding it, felt increasingly undeniable, a connection neither of them seemed capable of suppressing despite every rational reason to do so. She only hoped that whatever path lay ahead would not require sacrifices too severe for either of them to bear. Though the growing tension within the palace suggested such hope might prove increasingly difficult to maintain, as circumstances continued escalating toward what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Corin arrived at dawn with news that made Draven rise so quickly from his chair that it toppled backward against the stone floor. Say that again, Draven demanded, his voice carrying a sharpness that made even his longtime advisor take a careful step back. The elder who performed your bonding ritual, Corin said, his expression grave, has confessed, under careful and private questioning, that the signs during the ceremony were ambiguous at best. He interpreted them in favor of a bond with Lady Kaya because the alliance with Ashwood was considered essential at the time, and pressure came from multiple advisors, myself included, to secure that alliance regardless of what the ritual actually indicated. Draven felt the floor shift beneath him, though he remained standing through sheer force of will. You are telling me the bond is false, that I have spent these past months believing myself fated to a woman I feel nothing genuine toward, based on a ritual deliberately manipulated to serve political convenience. I am telling you, Corin said carefully, that the elder himself now questions the accuracy of his interpretation, given how thoroughly the pressure to secure the alliance may have influenced his reading of signs that were, by his own admission, unusually unclear. The revelation confirmed suspicions Draven had harbored for months, and yet hearing it stated so plainly still struck him with the force of genuine shock. He had built his entire understanding of his future around a bond that may never have existed in the way the kingdom had been told, a deception that implicated trusted advisors, sacred traditions, and his own willingness to accept circumstances without sufficiently questioning their validity. What of Lyra? He asked finally, the question emerging before he could fully consider its implications. Has anyone examined whether a true bond exists between us instead? Corin's expression carried careful consideration. The elder would need to perform a similar reading, though doing so discreetly, without alerting Kaya or her supporters, presents significant challenges. If word spreads that you are questioning the legitimacy of your current bond, particularly in favor of investigating a connection with a servant, the political fallout could prove immediate and severe. I understand the risks, Draven said, his voice carrying quiet determination, but I cannot continue building my future, and the future of my kingdom, upon a foundation of deliberate deception. If the bond with Kaya is false, the people deserve to know the truth, regardless of the complications such truth creates. They spent the following hours discussing careful strategies for verifying the truth, without triggering the very instability the original manipulation had been designed to prevent. Corin arranged for the elder to perform a private reading involving both Draven and Lyra, conducted in strictest secrecy, within a hidden chamber rarely used for such purposes. The ceremony itself proved unlike anything Draven had experienced during his original bonding with Kaya, where that ritual had felt distant, almost clinical in its execution. The moment the elder began the ancient words, with Lyra standing beside him, Draven felt something shift within his very being, a recognition so profound, it left him momentarily unable to breathe. The elder's expression, usually carefully neutral during such ceremonies, shifted to something approaching astonishment as the ritual progressed, the signs manifesting with a clarity he later admitted he had never witnessed in decades of performing such readings. "This is unmistakable," the elder said afterward, his voice carrying genuine reverence. "The connection between you is undeniable, far clearer than anything I observed during your original bonding ceremony. I made a grave error, my king, one that requires immediate correction." Draven turned to look at Lyra, who stood beside him with an expression mixing wonder and fear in equal measure, clearly processing the magnitude of what had just been confirmed between them. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It does," Draven agreed, reaching for her hand despite the presence of others in the chamber, needing the physical connection to ground himself amid the overwhelming revelation. "But it also creates immense danger, for both of us, and for the kingdom itself." The elder nodded gravely. "Lady Kaya's father will not accept this revelation easily, particularly given how much political capital was invested in securing the original alliance. There is significant risk of war if the situation is not handled with extreme care." Draven understood this risk intimately, having spent years navigating the delicate politics between competing pacts and territories. Breaking a sanctioned bond, even one proven false through legitimate ritual reassessment, would likely be viewed by Ashwood as a betrayal, regardless of the underlying truth that justified such action. "What do you suggest?" he asked Corin, seeking counsel from his most trusted advisor. "We must approach Ashwood's leadership directly, before Kaya learns of this discovery through other channels," Corin said. "Present the evidence clearly, acknowledge the error in judgment that led to the original false bonding, and propose alternative arrangements that might satisfy their need for continued alliance without requiring you to remain bound to a connection proven inaccurate." "Alternative arrangements," Draven repeated slowly. "What might satisfy their concerns, while allowing me to acknowledge the truth of my actual bond?" "Trade agreements, expanded border protections, perhaps a future match between Kaya and another suitable noble within your own territory," Corin suggested. "There are many paths toward maintaining peace that do not require sacrificing truth for the sake of political convenience." The plan carried significant risk, requiring delicate diplomatic navigation that could easily collapse if handled poorly. But Draven understood, with growing certainty, that continuing to pretend loyalty toward a false bond served no one, neither himself, nor Kaya, nor the kingdom whose stability depended upon genuine, sustainable peace, rather than deception built upon manipulated ritual. He turned to Lyra, still processing the magnitude of what had transpired within the hidden chamber. "This will not be simple," he said quietly. "The path forward involves significant risk, potential conflict with Ashwood, uncertainty about how the kingdom will react to such revelations." "I understand," Lyra said, her voice steadying, despite the obvious fear still evident in her expression. "But I cannot pretend the truth we have just witnessed does not exist, regardless of the complications it creates." "Nor can I," Draven agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "Whatever challenges lie ahead, I would rather face them honestly than continue building my future upon foundations I now know to be false." They spent the following days preparing carefully for the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. Corin working diplomatically to arrange discussions with Ashwood's leadership while maintaining careful secrecy from Kaya herself, who remained unaware that her carefully constructed position within the palace was about to face unprecedented challenge. Lyra, meanwhile, found herself navigating an entirely new reality, understanding that whatever remained of her time as a simple servant paying off familial debt had ended definitively within that hidden chamber. She was no longer merely a servant who had captured the king's passing attention, but potentially his true bonded mate, a position carrying implications she was only beginning to comprehend. The weight of this new reality settled upon her gradually as the days passed, alternating between exhilaration at the genuine connection now confirmed between herself and Draven, and terror at the political consequences such confirmation would inevitably trigger once revealed publicly. She understood, with increasing clarity, that the coming days would determine not only her own future, but potentially the stability of the entire kingdom, dependent upon how carefully Draven and his advisors managed to navigate revealing truth that threatened to unravel carefully constructed alliances built upon foundations that had, apparently, never been as solid as everyone had been led to believe. Whatever happened next, she resolved to face it with whatever courage she could muster, understanding that the connection now confirmed between herself and Draven was far too significant, far too undeniable, to sacrifice for the sake of maintaining comfortable illusions that had already begun crumbling beneath the weight of genuine truth. Kaya's father arrived at the palace with a procession of warriors large enough to make the intention behind the display unmistakable, his expression carrying barely restrained fury as he strode into the throne room, where Draven waited with Corrin at his side. "I received your message," the Ashwood leader said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You claim the bonding ritual was performed incorrectly, that my daughter is not, in fact, your fated mate. I understand this news is difficult to accept," Draven said, maintaining careful composure, despite the tension radiating through the hall. "But the elder who performed the original ceremony has confirmed, through subsequent examination, that the signs were misread due to political pressure surrounding the alliance's urgency." "Convenient timing for such a discovery," the Ashwood leader replied coldly, "given rumors already circulating about your growing attachment to a servant girl within your palace." The accusation hung in the air, and Draven understood immediately that Kaya had somehow learned of the situation before he had intended, likely alerting her father before proper diplomatic channels could manage the delicate revelation. "The truth of the bond has nothing to do with any personal feelings," Draven said firmly, though he knew this claim carried less than complete honesty. "The elder's confession stands independent of any other circumstances." Before the conversation could continue further, the throne room doors burst open, and Kaya herself entered, her expression carrying a fury that made several nearby guards instinctively reach for their weapons before recognizing her as no immediate physical threat. "You would humiliate me this way," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with barely contained rage. "After everything I sacrificed to secure this alliance, you would discard me for some criminal servant who happened to catch your attention." "Kaya," Draven said carefully, "this is not about discarding you. The bond itself was never genuine. Continuing to pretend otherwise serves neither of us, nor does it serve the genuine peace our territories require." "Genuine peace," Kaya repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call this? Breaking a sacred bond publicly, embarrassing my family before the entire kingdom, all so you can pursue whatever infatuation has captured your attention?" Her father stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to calm her, though his own expression suggested he shared much of his daughter's fury regarding the situation. "This cannot stand," he said to Draven. "Whatever irregularities existed during the original ceremony, the political reality remains unchanged. Our territories require this alliance to prevent conflict with the Northern Pax. I am prepared to offer alternative arrangements," Draven said, gesturing for Corrin to step forward with the proposals they had carefully prepared. "Trade agreements exceeding current terms, expanded military support along contested borders, and consideration of alternative matches within my own territory that might satisfy the need for continued alliance, without requiring a bond, proven false through legitimate ritual examination." The Ashwood leader studied the proposals Corrin presented, his expression carrying careful calculation despite his obvious anger regarding the situation. Kaya, meanwhile, remained visibly furious, her gaze shifting between Draven and the entrance to the throne room, as though searching for something, or someone. It was at this moment that Lyra entered, summoned by a guard who had been instructed to bring her once the confrontation reached this critical juncture, understanding that her presence would ultimately prove necessary regardless of the risks involved. "There she is," Kaya said, her voice dropping to something dangerously quiet as her gaze fixed upon Lyra, "the servant who has caused all this destruction." "Kaya," Draven warned, stepping between them protectively, though Kaya's fury seemed to have reached a point beyond careful restraint. "You think this changes anything?" Kaya said, addressing Lyra directly, ignoring Draven's attempt at intervention. "You think some manufactured ritual reading transforms you from criminal servant into worthy royal consort? You will always be beneath me, regardless of what false connection you claim exists. Kaya, that is enough, Draven said, his voice carrying an authority that finally seemed to penetrate her rage. Is it? Kaya demanded, turning back to face him directly. You would truly choose her over me? Over the alliance that prevents war? Over everything our bonding was meant to accomplish? I would choose truth, Draven said firmly, over deception, regardless of how convenient that deception might prove politically. And I would choose genuine connection over an arrangement that has clearly brought happiness to neither of us. The throne room fell silent, tension so thick it felt almost physical, as everyone present awaited the resolution of this confrontation that would determine not only the personal futures of those directly involved, but potentially the stability of relations between two significant territories. Kaya's father finally spoke, his expression carrying weary resignation rather than continued fury. The alternative arrangements you propose, he said slowly, they would need to be substantial, guaranteed through formal treaty, rather than mere promises. They will be, Draven assured him, whatever terms necessary to maintain peace between our territories, terms that reflect genuine commitment rather than deception, disguised as sacred bonding. The negotiations continued for some time, careful discussions regarding specific terms and guarantees, while Kaya remained standing apart, her expression shifting from fury to something approaching devastated resignation as she watched her father gradually accept the alternative arrangements Draven proposed. Eventually, as the discussions reached their conclusion, Kaya approached Lyra directly, her expression carrying complicated emotions that made Lyra brace herself for potential continued hostility. I do not forgive you, Kaya said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharp cruelty, replaced instead by something closer to genuine sadness. But perhaps I understand, at least partially, why this occurred. I never wanted this bond either, not truly. I only wanted the security and status it provided. The admission surprised Lyra, revealing vulnerability she had never witnessed from Kaya throughout their entire acquaintance. I am sorry for the pain this has caused you, Lyra said carefully, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected honesty. Perhaps somewhere else, some other match will provide the genuine connection I never found here, Kaya said, though her voice carried little conviction, more resignation than genuine hope. Take care of him. Despite everything, he deserves genuine happiness, even if it was never meant to be with me. With that, Kaya turned and departed the throne room alongside her father, leaving behind a silence that gradually gave way to quiet relief among those who remained. The immediate crisis had been navigated, alternative arrangements established that would maintain peace between the territories without requiring Draven to continue a bond proven fundamentally false. Draven turned to Lyra, his expression carrying exhaustion mixed with something like tentative hope. It is done, he said quietly. Whatever consequences remain to be navigated, the truth now stands, acknowledged openly, rather than hidden beneath political convenience. What happens now? Lyra asked, still processing the magnitude of everything that had just transpired. Now, Draven said, reaching for her hand, we determine together what our future looks like, free from the deception that has clouded these past months. The path forward remained uncertain, requiring careful navigation of court politics, public perception, and the practical challenges of transitioning Lyra from servant to whatever role she would ultimately occupy within royal life. But for the first time since her arrival at the palace, Lyra felt genuine hope regarding what lay ahead, understanding that whatever challenges remained, they would face them together, grounded in truth rather than manufactured obligation. 3 months passed before the kingdom finally settled into its new arrangement. The treaty with Ashwood formally signed and celebrated with considerably less fanfare than the original bonding ceremony had received, though its terms proved satisfactory enough that reports from the border regions indicated genuine relief among both territories that conflict had been successfully avoided. Lyra stood in a chamber far grander than anything she had occupied during her time as a servant, watching as attendants made final adjustments to a gown crafted from deep blue silk, the color chosen to represent both Draven's territory and, according to the seamstress, the calm strength Lyra had demonstrated throughout the tumultuous events of recent months. You look beautiful, Nora said, standing nearby with tears of genuine happiness visible in her eyes. The older woman had remained close to Lyra throughout the transition, one of the few servants who had known her before circumstances elevated her to entirely different status within the palace hierarchy. "I still cannot quite believe this is real," Lyra admitted, studying her reflection with an expression mixing joy and lingering disbelief. "Only months ago, I stood before this court in chains, facing potential execution for defending my brother." "Fate moves in unexpected ways," Nora said gently. "The king recognized something in you from the very beginning, something worth protecting and cherishing, regardless of the complications it created." Lyra thought of everything that had transpired since her initial arrival at the palace, the humiliation she had endured under Kaya's cruel treatment, the growing connection with Draven that had felt both impossible and increasingly undeniable, the danger she had faced when Kaya's jealousy escalated to genuine threat against her safety, and finally the confirmation of a true bond that had transformed her entire future. Her family had been located and brought to the palace weeks earlier, her mother initially overwhelmed by the transformation in her daughter's circumstances, her younger brother adjusting with the resilient enthusiasm typical of children faced with dramatic change. The debt that had originally bound her to royal service had been forgiven entirely, though Draven had insisted this forgiveness reflected genuine care rather than mere formality attached to their bond. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Corin entered, his expression carrying warmth that had grown considerably since their initial interactions during the early days of Lyra's presence at court. "The king requests your presence," he said, offering a respectful bow that still felt strange, given how recently she had occupied servant status herself. "The ceremony is ready to begin." Lyra took a steadying breath, gathering her composure, as Nora made final adjustments to her gown, before ushering her toward the door. The walk through the palace corridors felt surreal. The same pathways she had once traversed carrying trays and performing menial tasks, now leading her toward a bonding ceremony that would formally recognize her as Draven's true mate before the entire kingdom. The throne room had been transformed for the occasion, banners representing both Draven's territory, and, in a gesture of continued goodwill, subtle nods to Ashwood's colors as well, representing the peace maintained despite the dissolution of the original arrangement. Nobles filled the hall, many of the same faces who had witnessed her humiliation during that formal dinner months earlier, though their expressions now carried curiosity, mixed with growing respect, rather than the disdain she had once endured. Draven stood at the head of the hall, dressed in ceremonial attire that emphasized his role as king, while somehow also conveying a softness Lyra had rarely witnessed during his earlier, more guarded interactions with court members. As she walked toward him, their eyes met, and she saw reflected there the same intensity that had first caught her attention during those early days, when she had been nothing more than a servant paying off her family's debt. The elder who had performed both the original flawed ceremony and the subsequent private reading that confirmed their true bond stood ready to conduct the formal recognition, his expression carrying evident satisfaction at finally presiding over a bonding that reflected genuine truth rather than manufactured political convenience. "We gather today," the elder began, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "to formally recognize a bond, confirmed through ancient ritual, a connection proven genuine and undeniable between King Draven and Lyra, whose courage and integrity have demonstrated worthiness of this sacred union." The ceremony proceeded through traditional elements, ancient words spoken in the old tongue, symbolic gestures representing the joining of two lives and territories, though this bonding felt entirely different from the political theater that had characterized the original arrangement with Kaya. Every element carried genuine weight, genuine meaning, reflecting truth rather than obligation. As the ceremony concluded and Draven turned to address the assembled court, his voice carried confidence and warmth that seemed to reach every corner of the hall. "Many of you witnessed circumstances months ago that revealed uncomfortable truths about deception, disguised as sacred tradition," he said. "I stand before you today grateful that such truth was ultimately revealed, allowing genuine connection to flourish, rather than continued pretense that would have served no one well." He turned to Lyra, his expression softening considerably as he addressed her directly despite the public setting. "You entered this palace as a prisoner, facing circumstances that would have broken many people entirely. Instead, you demonstrated resilience, integrity, and courage that ultimately revealed the truth this kingdom needed, regardless of the risks such truth created for yourself personally. Lyra felt tears gathering as she listened to his words, the culmination of everything they had endured together, finally reaching this moment of public recognition and celebration. "I am grateful," she said, her voice carrying across the hall despite her nervousness at addressing such a significant gathering, "for the courage this kingdom showed in acknowledging difficult truths, and for the king who chose honesty over convenient deception, regardless of the political complications such honesty created." The court erupted into applause, a marked contrast to the cold reception she had originally received during her arrival months earlier, and Lyra understood, with growing certainty, that her transformation from prisoner to queen represented something the kingdom itself needed to witness, proof that genuine truth and courage could triumph over political convenience and manufactured deception. As celebrations continued throughout the evening, Lyra found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear and uncertainty of her initial arrival, the humiliation and danger she had faced under Kaya's jealous cruelty, the slow, undeniable connection that had developed with Draven despite every reason such connection should have remained impossible, and finally, the confirmation of truth that had transformed not only her own future, but the stability and integrity of an entire kingdom. Later that evening, as the formal celebrations concluded, and they finally found a quiet moment alone on a private balcony, overlooking the palace gardens, Draven took her hand, his expression carrying the same intensity that had first drawn her attention during those early, uncertain days of her service. "I never imagined circumstances would unfold this way," he admitted, "when I first saw you standing before the court, facing charges that could have ended your life entirely." "Nor did I," Lyra said, smiling despite the emotional weight of the day's events. "I only hoped to survive long enough to eventually return to my family, never imagining I would find genuine happiness within these very walls that initially represented nothing but fear and uncertainty." "Are you happy?" Draven asked, his voice carrying genuine concern, despite the joyful celebration surrounding them. "More than I ever believed possible," Lyra said honestly, meeting his gaze with complete sincerity. "Whatever challenges lie ahead, I am grateful to face them beside you, grounded in truth rather than obligation or deception." Draven pulled her closer, the distance between king and servant that had once seemed insurmountable, now entirely dissolved, replaced instead by genuine partnership built upon honesty, courage, and the undeniable connection that had ultimately proven stronger than political convenience or manufactured tradition. Below them, the palace gardens stretched peacefully beneath the evening stars, the same gardens where Lyra had once gathered herbs while navigating the uncertain early days of her service, now representing instead the foundation of a future neither of them had anticipated, but which both now embraced with genuine hope and happiness. Whatever challenges the kingdom would face in the years ahead, they would face them together, united not through manufactured ritual or political necessity, but through genuine connection, proven undeniable through both ancient tradition and the courage they had each demonstrated throughout their journey toward this moment of true and lasting happiness.